Hello, let's look at some pastoral poetry and romance as put in the classical traditional context before we then later move on to wrap up the Renaissance by looking at some of the bookend characters that are distinctive particularly to France and to England. So we're going to have Montaigne have a standalone, Rabelais and Shakespeare. But before that, Highet wants to take us through a different sort of genre that still had a classical hold on people, namely the pastoral. Now, the pastoral comes from the classics such as Theocritus's Idylls, which I actually have here. It's a thin book. You can see that. Theocritus was from the Alexandrian era. They're just small poetic lines. You can see there in a sort of meter. And then some other ones, Virgil follows him with his eclogues, or sometimes known as bucolics, and his georgics. And they mainly deal with pastoral life. The allure of pastoral life, the allure of the life of the shepherd. The simple farmhand who is connected with nature and is infused with the awe of nature. Usually the setting is in a particular place. Theocritus set it in Sicily. So Theocritus, coming in the Alexandrian era, set it in Sicily. But of course Sicily was a bit too close to Virgil, so Virgil changes that and he puts it back in Greece. So the Greek-speaking Theocritus from Alexandria places it in modern-day Italy, and then the modern-day Italian Virgil, even though it was a man-twin, Sicily was still a little bit too close. He goes back and places it in Arcadia, which is in the Peloponnese. We want this sort of wandering shepherd ideal when we talk about the pastoral. And anytime anyone's kind of wants to retreat from the city, the urban life, to something of peace, tranquility, in tune with nature, that's pastoral, and it does draw on classical themes. The wandering shepherd, a bit more than strenuous ploughman. You do have his works and days. That's a little more of a sort of work manual, a little guide. You see that a bit more in Georgics. Pure pastoral is a bit more tranquil, it's a bit more retreative, contemplative, rather than having any sort of physicality associated with it. Hence the Idyll coming from sort of the simple Idyll. Think of even Wagner later has Siegfried's Idyll. It's before Siegfried gets pulled into the whole convulsion of the ring cycle. In the classical tradition, the shepherd has classical elements around him, such as nymphs, satyrs, flora and fauna, certain distinctive call-outs for the flora and fauna that can even personify these plant creatures. The shepherd has life, he's vitality. That's what he's meant to represent and what his whole environment is meant to represent. It's interconnected, as we sort of spoke, you're in tune with nature. So think of Emerson, think of a sort of transcendentalist ideal. And not only nature, but sort of the wider universe. And hence that it is quite pagan. Our earliest concrete Idyll, as we said, comes from that Alexandrian age, Theocritus. And what was happening in that Alexandrian age? Well, the city, Alexandria, was one of the most urban, expansive cities. Spengler would have called it a megalopolis right at the end of the Greek civilization, before it eventually twinned with the Roman one. So it's interesting that it's Theocritus in this Alexandrian urban setting that finds the retreat of the pastoral. And similarly, Virgil in Rome will find the retreat of the pastoral as an allure. Virgil transplants Theocritus' idea and shifts the retreat from being in Sicily to Greece, so it sort of has a twin appeal in Roman thought, back to the nobility, the purity of Greece and Greek ideal and Greek art, whilst also having the foreign exotic element of it, and having it far away from the Roman politics of the time. Later attempt to fuse with this is the romance. So Highet puts them together in his chapter 9. He calls it the pastoral and the romance. And the reason he decides to twin that is because in the romance, a lot of the time, it's a romantic plot between characters in an idyllic or pastoral setting. Highet cites 3 distinctive works that add the romance flavour that are beyond just Virgil and Theocritus, who we discussed before. They're the Ethiopica by Heliodorus, Clitophon and Leucippe by Achilles Tatius, and Daphnis and Chloe, probably the most famous, by Longus. And I have the latter two here, just to give you a context. They're quite difficult to come by if you're browsing in shops, but you go online, you can see Oxford Classics still doing them, translation versions. There's Daphnis and Chloe, and you can see they're quite thin. Achilles Tatius, Leucippe, and Clitophon are slightly longer. These are in novel forms rather than Theocritus's meter. So when you add the romance, usually what we see is a novel form emerging. Romance is kind of the place for rhetoric, epigrams, invention. They deal with long separations of lovers usually, their unflinching fidelity amidst a host of trials and chance occurrences come in. So we're seeing something getting closer to the modern novel, or the 18th century novel, at least you can put on a par with that. So something by Samuel Richardson or so, which we'll see later in the Baroque era, is kind of on a par with these works by Longus. And so even if Richardson's book is far more expansive, Clarissa by Richardson, for instance, is far more expansive. These guys found translations into French and English around the 16th century. Expansion on the translation within the Renaissance, which helped inspire a lot of its fusion, still, hence why Highet wants to tell us about it whilst he's still in the Renaissance, ostensibly. The Ethiopica and Clitophon and Leucippe, they're adventures that are consistent with the love affair thread, but Daphne and Chloe is notable for combining the romantic adventure with the pastoral atmosphere of charm. They're not high literature. You can't really think of them as a tragedy or an epic in the forms that we'd already seen before. They don't really employ part the mind and soul into profound contemplation. Remember that we had the meanings of an epic way back in my second video on the classical tradition, and it was an epic was still meant to hold within its adventure, profound moral truth, which these kind of fall down on a little bit. It's ultimately escape literature, providing reader with pseudo wish fulfillment. So we do see that today. And sometimes that can get mistaken for epic in a contemporary audience or modern audience. It's not really an epic. You can't really call Virgil the classical link, or Homer the classical link to something, even if the plot is engaging in a sort of epic style. You're probably getting more towards something like this rather than the epic. Style even reflects youthful romance. That sort of immaturity of style. The vices and antithesis and oxymoron mirror the jeune perception of the world as black or white. And Theocritus' Sicily and Virgil's Arcadia, romance's retreat from obscenities of corruption in the city, courtly life. You can think of them as antithesis to that which Machiavelli would have been bringing forward in the time of the Renaissance, hence why they had an allure in that time as a foil to that realistic politicking that Machiavelli was giving in his advice to princes. And particularly as we've industrialized as a society, that allure of the pastoral and with twin romance escape novels has grown significantly. But it's interesting that we note that, the musical idealance or call out of a Pan or Apollo is usually quite absent. But we were still seeing it in music when Grieg and Bartók wanted to captivate it. Think of Beethoven's Sixth Symphony. And in religion, we say of Jesus himself that he was a shepherd, right? So there are many different threads that are both classical and non-classical. That's just common to the human experience here. But it's interesting to know that the classical has its place amongst that pantheon. So when we reach the Renaissance, what actual works do we see that mimic this? So the French play Robin and Marion, so using the Robin Hood theme, putting it in a romantic setting, is by Adam de la Halle from 1250, and that's sort of middle age, probably the earliest one you can say. You've got the Edith Frank Gautier by Philippe de Vitry, a friend of Petrarch, so we're moving towards the Renaissance, but still large influence from Provençal poets at that point. And then we reach Boccaccio, who we've already spent time on, the Admetus or Ametto, we're in 1341 now. That focuses on a conversion of the shepherd. Remember, Boccaccio had that conversion from paganism to Christianity late in life. So the conversion of the shepherd from physical love to spiritual admiration sort of mirrors Boccaccio's own experience and fuses it with ideals of the romance that he'd already had in his previous love novel, Fiammetta, which we also discussed on the video on Boccaccio. An important work is Jacopo Sannazzaro's Arcadia, which actually calls out Arcadia by name and helps set up the whole flow of Et in Arcadia Ego, which we saw paintings of by Poussin, and it's called out that idea of back in Arcadia it's even there all the way down to the 20th century when you have Evelyn Waugh trying to depict it amongst a crumbling British Empire, British imperial framework, when he has put out more flags or he has Brideshead Revisited. But in 1504, Sannazaro began actually calling out Arcadia and putting it into the mind of other people. His monarch was Frederick of Aragon, whose exile in France he shared. In his Arcadia, he has dropped the allegorizing that Boccaccio was fond of for more vivid details of rural life. And his landscape comparing, there's elements of Homer in there, Virgil, Theocritus, Ovid, the whole lot. The shepherds hold games. We had them as a classical call out in the Renaissance epic. So Sannazaro still being in that milieu. He's in the milieu of a Ludovico Ariosto, who's making the Renaissance epic Orlando Furioso. And they have a sort of lift me or let me lift you sort of challenge in the wrestling. So Sannazaro still wants to use themes that he sees other people do, that they're more applying it to epic. His is more the idyllic retreat, hence the call-out name of Arcadia. Another character that comes up is that of Diana the Huntress. And we have Diana of Jorge de Montemayor, or Montemor, Portuguese, who saw Sannazaro's popularity in Italy and wanted to put that into Spain. Daphnis and Chloe itself was remade many times in the Renaissance. The romance with a pastoral setting. So, of course, it's going to have influences. Think Cervantes, Galatea, and Don Quixote. And often in a romance in a pastoral setting, you're going to see Venus kind of have a flirtation with Pan. That's quite, if you want to insert your pagan gods into your pastoral, that's one of the romances you'll see. So often the characters will be on their own romance, and either there'll be an allusion between Pan and Venus there, or possibly they'll be on their own sort of side plot or above plot on the spiritual love. Shakespeare uses these stories, think Two Gentlemen of Verona, I believe it's called out. It's called out in The Twelfth Night. Love's Labour Lost. So all of those sort of romantic comedies of Shakespeare have these elements to them. It's also, at this point, we should notice that we mentioned Edward Spenser in The Faerie Queene when he wrote the epic, and what sort of devices the Faerie Queene had as an epic. Spenser, just before that, wrote things like The Shepherd's Calendar, which have Arcadian influences. Milton wrote a Comus. He wrote many things that had the Arcadian influence. But they were all building upon the originator of the Arcady into England, which was Sir Philip Sidney, who wrote The Countess of Pembroke's Arcadia, which was just a little bit before Spenser chimed in with his Shepherd's Calendar by 1579. In France, you're more thinking of works by Clément Marot, Ronsard, and most successfully Honoré d'Urfé's Astrea, published in 1607, so around the tail end of Spenser. The scene and period for this is 5th century Gaul, the time of barbarian invasion. So it goes back to late Roman, which is an interesting choice. And then you can take that French tradition all the way from Honoré d'Urfé's Astrea all the way right through to the Saint-Pierre's Paul and Virginia, which was published 1788, right before the eve of the French Revolution and the collapse of the Ancien regime in France. So that runs straight through there. And even you see call-outs, not only in Bernardin de Saint-Pierre's Paul and Virginia, as we said, but even in Rousseau, in his that idyllic retreat back to the noble savage, has its Arcadian influences. We mentioned Milton, and I think his Lycidas is probably one of the best of the Renaissance entering the Baroque era poems about Arcady. It combines the pastoral with a sense of Christian duty, whilst also being a sort of elegy at the same time. So it's got a great mix. He's building upon Sannazaro, Montemayor, Virgil, all of these to come together. And Milton had been twinned. If you ever get a Milton Major Works, all of these are contained in there, along with the Paradise Lost. You have Lycidas, you have his smaller works where he's building towards Lycidas in L'Allegro and Il Penseroso, which are obviously building upon Italian influences. And when he's twinning in Lycidas the Christian with the pagan classical tradition, which of course he's also trying to do as an epic form in Paradise Lost, he's trying to do a pastoral form in Lycidas. He has St. Peter denouncing bad pastors when he has them, quote, blind mouths that scarce themselves know how to hold a sheep hook, or have learnt aught else, the least that the faithful herdman's art belongs. We've already mentioned the expansion of the theatre in Renaissance drama, and it's no surprise to find the pastoral leaking into fields that aren't strictly literary. Politian had Orpheus, and the Orpheus as the sort of guide, the music tamer, the charmer of the rural life, has its part, obviously lending itself to music, the Orpheus myth, more than the purely literary place. And that's why we see the operas of Orpheus and Eurydice spring up from the time at the Ferrara court in the 1500s to thereafter. Soon appeared in France. Think of The Shades by Nicolas Filleul by 1566. And they're taking Boccaccio's Admetus, which had been around since the late Middle Ages, and trying to spin it into little operatic pasts and so on. Tasso would call his pastoral works the Favole Boccarecce, Tales of the Woods, which would help broaden the appeal. So he wouldn't just stay in this sort of more kind of treeless Arcadia ideal. He'd expand the nature and the connection to nature to include the wood-like setting. As would Shakespeare in As You Like It. Other works, let's just rattle them off here. Milton's Comus by 1634, is a masque. Ranucci's Daphne, 1594. Handel's Aetius and Galatea. Again, going into the 18th century, we've got Bach's Peasant Cantata, it's Phoebus and Pan. Gluck's Orpheus and Eurydice is probably the most famous. It's seen as the first modern opera, which came to us in 1762 on a pastoral and romantic setting. You've got Orpheus, who is linked with the shepherd tamer, the sort of soothsayer, and his romantic element is with Eurydice, so it lends itself to opera perfectly. And speaking of soothsayers, we have Rousseau produced The Village Soothsayer and began Daphnis and Chloe, the same artistic purpose. So I think you should think of the pastoral tradition as particularly lending itself to music. Smetana's Bartered Bride. Highet calls out Mascagni's Rustic Chivalry, Vaughan Williams's Hugh the Drover. All the way down to Rodgers and Hammerstein's Oklahoma on an American setting. Yes, still pulling from that Daphnis and Chloe appeal. Arcadia never truly dies. Pastoral tradition continued through the era of the Revolution. Mallarmé's Afternoon of a Faun still calls out to it. We'll talk about that more later. Debussy's Prelude to the same poem then puts that setting into music. Nijinsky's Ballet on the same theme. In painting, it strives for the seemingly far removed from the classical tradition. By Picasso's 1947 Joy of Life, we have kind of seemingly moved away from that. But wherever is heard the flute, the shepherds' names, Damon, Chloe, Phyllis, Ophelia, these are direct call-outs to the shepherds and shepherdesses and characters that we see in the likes of a Theocritus and a Virgil. These are someone with a simple love of nature. We call that all that contains the echoes of the Idyll and the Eclogue.